In today's video, I'm going to be talking to you about sewing myths. I have 10 myths that I thought were true when I started sewing. Turns out they're not. So let's get started. So just before we get started, I apologise if you can hear a background sound. Hopefully I'll be able to get rid of it in post-production, but there's a grass cutter across the road and he doesn't seem to be going anywhere, so I wanted to get on and make this video, so hopefully it won't impact you too much. So I just want to say hi. I know I've been away for a little while, having a bit of a break. I did leave a community post explaining everything, so thanks to those of you that saw that and commented and supported me. I really appreciate it. I'm feeling much better now. And I want to get on and do some videos for you, especially at this trying time when things are really difficult for a lot of us. I thought some frivolous YouTube videos might help us to take our mind off stuff. So today I thought I would talk to you about 10 myths or things that I thought were fact when I started sewing when I was 39, and I'm 45 now, so nearly 6 years ago. When I started sewing and I was learning from YouTube videos. The whole environment of YouTube videos back then was very different to how it is now. I would say now people are much more willing to show their mistakes. And talking of mistakes, if you saw my last video, which was a sew along or sew with me type video, if you haven't seen it, I will link it above. So that was basically let's sew the fuller cardigan, and I show you how to make it, but I also show you the mistakes that I made while I was making it. So yeah, do check that out. It'll be in the description box below. So let's get on with these facts, shall we, before you start throwing things at the TV or the screen. If I look over to the side, it's just that I've got the list over there on my laptop. These are in no particular order, then also not aimed at throwing judgment on anyone else. It is just things that I believed when I started sewing, and actually through my experience I come to understand that not so much that they're not true, but they're not as important as I thought they were. So the first thing, and they're in no particular order, is in order to sew garments you need to be able to sew in a straight line. I can't tell you when I started sewing how many times I looked at my wonky straight line and just thought to myself, I can't sew, I have no talent for sewing, I'm not going to be able to do this. How can I make clothes if I can't even sew in a straight line? And believe me, some of my lines were wonky, and to be fair, some of them still are, if I'm honest. There's things you can do to help yourself sew in a straighter line. And B, actually, I make clothes now, they're not all in a dead straight line, I have to be honest. They're just not in a straight line, and so as much as I try to be accurate, it doesn't always happen. Some things that I do now to help me is I will put a piece of washi tape on my sewing machine and then butt my fabric up against that washi tape, and that helped me keep a fairly straight line. Sometimes I might draw on my fabric in a removable ink a seam line and then stitch along that seam line if it's really important that I get a straight line, or draw it in chalk or something else. You can also buy like little magnetic things. I do have one somewhere, but I can't remember where I've put it because I don't use it. But that's something I bought very early on, was like a little magnetic thing that you put on your sewing machine and you butt your fabric up against it. But because it's magnetic, you do have to be careful if you've got an electronic sewing machine. So yeah, I would say accuracy is something to strive for, but it's not the be all and end all. And I think when I started with YouTube, all the sewing YouTubers that I would watch back then always only ever showed really precise lines. It did make me feel a little bit inferior, if I'm honest, and that's one of the reasons when I started my own YouTube channel, it was my focus that I would show you my experience, warts and all, because I just want you to know that it is normal to be making mistakes, not sewing a straight line, etc, etc. So the next one is that pressing is not important. I'm going to hold my hands up here and tell you that I can be quite lazy and cut corners when I want to. And I do, even now, cut pressing corners, and I only press if I absolutely have to. But when I press, I get much, much better results. I really do. I've heard from so many YouTubers and sewing professionals saying that the difference between not pressing and pressing is between a homemade garment and a handmade garment. And in some ways it is true. You can get away with not doing too much pressing. So what I'll do is I will sew the seams that I need to sew that I can get away with before pressing. So then when I do go to the ironing board, I press as many seams as I can at the same time. And that's a really good tip. Instead of sewing a seam, going to the ironing board, sewing another seam, going back to the ironing board. Who's got time for that? Quite honestly, not me. I might have time, I don't have the energy for it. So I will sometimes, if I'm just sewing for me and I'm not doing a step-by-step process for you guys, I will, I'll press when I have to press. Quite honestly, it does make a huge difference. Number 3 is that hand sewing is not worth the effort. You may or you may not have noticed, but I have a tremor. It's something I've had all my life, and so hand sewing is quite difficult for me. When I started to sew, I was hearing so many stories from professionals saying, oh, you know, your garment will look so much better if you just hand stitch your hem, or, you know, you're facing down or whatever it is. And I was reluctant. I was really, really reluctant. I absolutely hated hand stitching, and part of that was my tremor, but it was also that it took so long to do, and I thought that I was rubbish at it, because I've watched so many videos on how to hand sew hems, etc. And a really good one actually is Anika from Made to Sew, which I'm sure you all know. She's a huge channel, lovely lady, and she does really good tutorials. But when I was practicing myself, and I would pick up that little bit of fibre on the inside, because you don't want to pick up too much what shows on the outside, but no matter how small the fibre I picked up with my needle, you could see it on the other side. It's not so bad when you're using a matching thread, but if you wasn't using a matching thread, it looked horrendous. And so I used to just avoid it at all costs, really. So I've slowly come to terms with the fact that if I want a really nice looking garment that is a little bit better than the garment I would have had, then I will hand sew. And I would, at the stage I'm at now, I always choose to hand sew rather than stitch a hem or a facing down, which this is a bad example because I did sew this with the sewing machine, but because it rippled a little bit when I made my other two, I did hand stitch them. But I would say, if you are someone who really cannot stand hand stitching, don't do hand stitching. If you're happy with your sewing, with, you know, how you sew the hems, etc., carry on doing that. Do what works for you. That's the brilliant thing about learning online. We can pick up tips and techniques from other people and just adapt what works for us into our sewing. So the next one, number 4, is that everyone else's sewing is perfect and mine is a failure. Now this goes back to the first tip when I said about not being able to sew a straight line, and I would just look at everyone else's and think, oh, it's so good, it's so perfect. Why can't I sew like that? I think part of it is I'm not great with accuracy, and it's something to this day I am still trying to hone and get better at. But you know, I will just whiz through that sewing machine like I was on an assault horse going like this. It's not quite like that now, but it certainly was like that at times in the beginning. But you know, I would just say, if you feel like that, I'd just say stop being so hard on yourself. And I'm talking to myself here. No one's sewing is perfect. You know what it's like? It's the whole Instagram thing where what people show you online is not really their reality. It's just what they want you to think is their reality. So if they only show you pretty pictures, their life is not full of pretty pictures. And likewise, their sewing isn't going to be perfect, even if that's what they put out. I would say just believe in yourself, even if your sewing isn't perfect. Practice makes progress and you will get there. And if you don't, you know, as long as you're happy with your sewing and your level of learning, that should be fine, shouldn't it? Number 5 goes on from number 4, and it's that mistakes are the end of the world and make me give up. And I still experience this even now. I am slowly learning to just walk away from the garment if it's really causing me problems. Go and have a good sleep that night, come back to it the next day. Rushing is half of the problem here. When I was first sewing, I would absolutely love it if I could finish a garment in 3 hours or a couple of hours, same day, whatever. I would see that as a real coup. But by doing that, by rushing a garment, I was more likely to make mistakes. And then when a mistake happens, and especially if it's a mistake that you can't rectify without starting again, then I would just lose my mind and just think, I can't do this. But you know what? You can do it and you will do it, but you just got to take your time sometimes. And also, if there's a technique that you really are struggling with, just practice it on a scrap bit of paper. If you struggle with buttonholes, make buttonholes on a scrap bit of paper. If you struggle with attaching shirt collars on a shirt, practice that on a little bit of fabric. If you struggle with sewing straight lines, practice it on a bit of paper. Practice does make progress. You will get better if you keep trying. That's just something that I have learned throughout the years. Right, can I just pause to say that if you're getting any value from this video, you do hit the subscribe button, the like, and do leave me a comment down below, because doing all those things tells YouTube that my video is worth sharing to other people, and then that will help me widen my reach. So I really appreciate it if you could do that. Number 6 is cutting on the grain is too confusing. Now, when I started sewing, I would cut on the grain. Well, I wouldn't cut on the grain. I tried to cut on the grain. I would follow instructions on how to cut on the grain, which involves measuring your grain lines the same distance at the top and the bottom of it along the edge of your fabric. But for some reason, when I was first learning this, I just could not get it. I don't know if it was my fibro brain just like being really confused and foggy, or it was confusing. 5 years down the track, having sewed, I don't think it's confusing at all, but I can really appreciate as a new sewer, it is something that takes a little while to get to grips with. I think also it didn't help that I was buying cheap fabric that was either printed off grain or was not actually cut on grain. But something that I always do in a woven fabric now is I'll snip a little bit of the edge and then I'll rip the fabric, because when it rips, it will rip on grain. When you fold it over, you can then align it on grain, and you know that's easier to do. I can do a whole video on that if you'd like that. Do leave a comment down below if that's something you'd be interested in. So the next myth is, and this is a more of a plus size one, is that all the patterns that I found that look amazing on the models, the sample pieces, I assumed they would look amazing on me. Rarely was this the case. It really wasn't. I can't tell you how many patterns I have in my stash that I just haven't ended up making, or I've made and they just did not look good on me, because the model that is modelling them is like a size 8 or a size 10, and she gives a completely different look to the pattern to a larger person. Skirts are a great example. I love a big flowing skirt on people, but on me, they just don't look right. There's a few different ways that I approach things now compared to then. In the beginning, I would buy the pattern, even if it didn't come in my size, and then I would say I would grade it up, and then I'd grade it up to the point where it was barely recognisable, and then it didn't suit me. I think it's having a really good eye for knowing what suits you, and in the beginning I had no clue whatsoever. But the way I approach it now, if I see a pattern that I like in a slimmer model, I will look to see if there's any larger ladies modelling that and see what it looks like on them, because I'm going to get a much better idea. If you saw my video about the magazines, the Knit Mode magazines, where they showed larger ladies sampling as well as slimmer ladies, I explained in there that I found it really, really helpful to see that, because it gives me a really good idea of wherever it's going to suit me. And the other thing that I don't do now is I don't buy patterns that don't fit, that don't come in my size. So I'm a size 22 to 26, so 22 upper and 26 at the hip. And if I see a pattern I love and it comes up to a size 20, I don't buy it anymore. I've got plenty of patterns in my stash that go up to a size 20 or a size 18. They just don't fit me and I haven't used them. And it came to a point where I just stopped wasting my money on patterns that did not fit me. And I feel so much better mentally for having done that. And now, because there is so much more range with plus size patterns, I can look at a pattern, look at a plus size lady wearing it, and then assess if it really suits me. And if it does, I'll buy the pattern. And if it doesn't, I won't. Number 8, pattern sizes are the same as ready-to-wear sizes. Now, this is something I struggled with, and I know a lot of new sewers do struggle with this, because I see questions around this on Facebook groups all the time. Someone might say, I am a size 14 in ready-to-wear. Why am I a size 24 in this? Or, I made a size 14 because that's the size I am, and it doesn't fit, it's far too small for me. So the thing that I didn't understand when I started sewing was that the ready-to-wear size and the pattern size are not the same. And actually, what I didn't understand was that you have to completely dismiss the pattern size altogether. So if you're looking for a pattern, let's see if we can find one. So on this pattern, which I've got here, this comes in sizes 6 to 18. But size 6 to 18 doesn't actually mean anything to me, because even in ready to wear, one shop you might be a size 8, another shop you might be a size 16, because they all have different measurements to each size, and there's a lot of vanity sizing in shops, so where they will put smaller sizes on clothes to make you feel better that you fit into a smaller size, but actually it doesn't mean anything at all. So what is better to do, and that's what I do now, is I look at the measurements. So first of all, I will measure my bust, which is the fullest part of your bust. I will measure the upper bust, which is around there. I will measure my waist and my hips. So I'll note those numbers down, and then I'll look on a pattern and see which sizes most closely resemble my sizes, and then choose that pattern size. And I have stopped putting meaning onto a pattern size. If I sat and thought about the fact that I'm a size 26 in the hips, I might not like it very much. But it is just a size. What is the point in wearing a smaller size just to feel better when it won't fit you and it's too tight? I'm so past that. I can't believe my mindset actually when I started sewing. I'll never forget the first time I took my measurements so that I could make something to wear. I took my measurements and then I tried to make a Tilly and the Buttons dress, and we all know Tilly and the Buttons dresses are not very, or they were not very size inclusive back then. And I, as good as had a breakdown over the fact, A, of the actual measurements of my body, and B, the fact that I couldn't wear them. I'd been in avoidance for years and years, just buying a certain size in a shop, going to a shop where I always went to the same shop where I knew the clothes fitted me, and I would choose the size that they had that fitted me, which was the largest size. But I was in denial the whole time because I was just relying on that size and not the measurements. I had no idea what my measurements were. Sorry, I just got cut off there. So basically, the gist is that once I understood that the ready-to-wear sizes and the pattern sizes had no correlation whatsoever, and I just started looking at the actual measurements that fit my body, I was on the road to getting a much better fit in my garments. So the next one was that zippers and buttonholes are too difficult and I avoid them like the plague. Now this is kind of half true, but it shouldn't be true, so that's why I've put it in as a myth, because I understand that it's not true. They're not difficult, but because I avoid doing them, they are. Now I've had different experiences with zippers versus buttonholes, so I'll go over them separately. The zippers, now to be fair, I was doing zippers from day one, because before I was garment sewing, I was making pouches and you have to put zippers in. That helped immensely in terms of doing zippers in garments. But once I started putting them into garments, I found I was using invisible zippers more than I was using normal zippers. And so I practiced loads with invisible zippers and got really good at them. But the normal zippers, I completely forgot how to do altogether. And to this day, I don't tend to sew with them unless I really have to. I will normally avoid it. Because the clothes I wear a lot of jersey. As you can see, I've got my laundry day tee on here with my fuller. They're both jersey. And in jersey, you don't need zips because you can just pull it on and off. But where I do need a zip, I'll put one in, but I will always try to put an invisible zip in, just because I find them much easier to put in. But I know it's the complete opposite for some other people, and it is all about how much you practice them. Because I haven't practiced normal zippers, therefore I'm not great at putting normal zippers in, and I avoid them. With buttonholes, I didn't do them immediately, and I put off doing them forever because everyone said that they're really difficult. And then once I tried to do them, I had nothing but trouble with my sewing machines. So I had the Tilly and the Buttons sewing machine, which I don't know, you can just see it up there. The Tilly and the Buttons sewing machine, I call it a Tilly and Buttons machine. It's not a Tilly and the Buttons machine, it's a Janome machine. But I found out about it on the Tilly website. So that one I think I paid about $500 for, and it was my first serious sewing machine. I'd had another sewing machine that cost about $200 before that, but it was a heap of bleep, bleep, bleep. But this one was the first one that I was serious about, and I had part exchanged my other one for that one, and it was a lot of money for me to put down. So I was really disappointed actually when the buttonhole didn't work. I would set up to do a buttonhole and it would just sew over the same spot continuously, and I took it in to be fixed and they said it was the sensor that was gone, and they replaced it, and it happened again, so I had to go in a second time. And they did fix it the second time, and I've never had any more problems. In fact, the sewing machine you can see in my background just there it's the Brother Innovis NV1800Q, and that was a sewing machine that cost double the price of that one, and it was my dream sewing machine. I was wanting that sewing machine for quite a long time, and I eventually managed to get it, and I bought that probably 2 or 3 years ago now. Haven't looked back. I'm not looking at any other sewing machine. Whereas before, because I wasn't happy with my sewing machines, I just kept looking for the bigger, brighter, more exciting model. But I'm very, very happy with that sewing machine. However, there are a few things it does need a service, because buttonholes, I'm having the same problem I did there, and I'm starting to wonder whether it's me rather than the sewing machine. But the sensor seems to have gone on that one, and I use that sewing machine for everything except when I need to do buttonholes. I have to get this one out, and I do not look forward to buttonholes at all. I really don't. There's so many aspects to buttonholes that I find really difficult. And what annoys me more than anything, I will do it on a practice run. I might make 3 buttonholes practice. They come out absolutely perfect. Then I'll do it on my garment that I've been working about 12 hours on, and it messes up. I have now learned how to unpick a buttonhole to almost perfection, so it's not the end of the world like it once was. But I feel really heavy-hearted when I have to do a buttonhole in a garment. As you can see from the fuller cardigans, I've just made 3 fuller cardigans, and I haven't put buttonholes in any of them. Technically I should have, but I wouldn't wear them done up anyway, so I took the excuse not to make buttonholes. But really I should force myself to make them more often. So the gist of this myth is, if you don't avoid something and you practice it lots, you'll become much better at it. I know this and I still avoid it. But, you know, that's life. At least I know after 5 years of sewing that practice does make progress. And if I do practice it, I will progress with it. But, you know, there's the other side of my brain that is telling me, no, you don't need to do that. Be fine without it. Can you relate? Leave me a comment down below if you can relate to that. We've just got one more, and that is making my own bias binding is a waste of fabric. Now that is what I used to think when I was first sewing. I don't think that at all now. I actually love to make my own bias binding. It does take a bit of fabric because it has to be cut on the bias, so that it has to be cut diagonally across the fabric, and that means it uses quite a bit of fabric. Although that was my initial reason for not wanting to do them, it wasted fabric, it took loads of time, when I can just buy a reel. I don't know where they are, but I bought some reels of bias binding for like £5 for like, I don't know, like 10 metres of it or something. It's like a satiny bias binding, but I can tell you it is not cut on the bias, and they won't cut it on the bias because that will seem like a waste of money to them. I'm sure you can buy ones that are cut on the bias that cost a bit more, but the ones I bought were definitely not cut on the bias, and you can really feel that when you're trying to go around a curve, when you're attaching the fabric to a curve, and it just will not curve round. So because I became frustrated with that and it was giving me subpar results, I did start to make my own bias binding, which I first made on my coat. On my, it'll come to me, what's the coat called? Sienna jacket. On my Sienna jacket I made my own bias binding and it was fantastic. I was so pleased that I went to that effort. It is so simple to do. If you'd like me to do a video on making my own bias binding, do leave a comment down below and I'll see if I can put that together. But yeah, it's totally not a waste of fabric, and I would say the great thing about making your own bias binding is you can make it to match your garment. It's going to be really, really difficult, if not impossible, to find bias binding pre-bought that matches your garment. So it just gives you that little extra bit of professionalism in your garment making. So can you relate to any of these myths that I shared with you? If you can, leave a comment down below. Have you got any myths that you believe were true to sewing when you started that you found out were not that important or not true? Leave them down below as well, because we can all learn from each other, and that'd be really great if we can do that. I just want to wish you happy and healthy thoughts. Stay away from the virus and leave me a comment down below. Let me know if you've got some time off work, if you have how are you going to spend that? Are you going to do some sewing? If so, what patterns are you going to make? I'd love to know. I've been going through a bit of a where I lost my sojo a little bit, and I've still lost it. I'm sort of forcing myself to do a bit now in order to get it back, but yeah, I have lost it a bit, and I could really do with some encouragement, but through just like finding new patterns, etc. So do let me know what you're up to down below, because that might just help me to get my sojo back. So until next time, happy sewing. Bye for now.